Welcome everyone. This is tonight's topic is about the Kennebunk Poor Farm, and the Poor Farm was in operation from 1825 until about 1939 in Kennebunk. And I originally stumbled upon the fact that it even existed when I got a call from a friend, Cindy Brockway, and Wayne, her husband Wayne, up on High Street, called me one day and said, "We have something we want to show you. Would you like to pop up and take a look?" And so I walked up to their house, and lo and behold, in their walkway they had some marble pieces that unfortunately were about the size of gravestones. And under their downspout to their house, they had another one that somebody had kind of put as a splash guard. And then they said that they had another one yet that they had found in their basement when they came to own the house, and it was actually written on and somebody's name was on it. And I said, holy, where did these come from? And they said, well, we think they came from the Poor Farm cemetery that used to be behind our house. So they pointed me in the direction of where that was, and I was lucky enough to go over to the property and to the property owner and ask them if I could look at the grounds where this supposed cemetery once was. And they said, sure, you'd be happy, we're happy to let you do that. I'm just going to change this one little thing here, sorry. So anyway, I did that, and I started wondering, well, who are these people? Who's buried here? All it looks like is some woods and, a bunch of blue tarp, the main flag, some discarded items. And then I started noticing little markers, little marble markers, not with any names on them, but just like placed to indicate where a footstone would be. Quite a few of them, really, but then it was so overgrown and whatnot that it was kind of hard to see them. So I started doing some research at the Brick Store Museum and online, and found out that sure enough, there used to be a house there in the 1800s that was owned by Nathaniel Cousins' father, Ichabod. I don't know if all of you know where the Cousins School is, but Cousins School was named for a Revolutionary War soldier named Nathaniel, and this was his family's home. If you go to this site now, you'll see that it's a 1950s ranch, and the old building is gone. So I'm going to kind of share screens here and see if I can pull up a picture of that, and we'll get started. All right. Allison, I'm going to ask you if you're able to see what I'm seeing with a house on the screen.
We are, yes.
Okay, good. This was the Ichabod Cousins home. It was built in 1752, and it was on the Catmousem Road. And by the time that the town of Kennebunk acquired it, it had gotten into quite a bit of disrepair. But let me back up a little bit. Every town in Maine has a committee that is appointed by the Board of Selectmen, and they are called overseers of the poor. They are responsible for enumerating how many people in town are paupers or in need of support from the town. And every year they generate a town report that tells how much has been spent to take care of the people at the poorhouse. But when we became a state in 1820, and then subsequently a town in 1820, we separated from Wells, and we had a brand new government. So in 1821, just a year later, we created our own committee called the Overseers of the Poor, and they decided that what was then in place was not working. Up until that point, people who needed support would be taken in by members of the community and taken care of, and then the town would reimburse them. But that came to be quite a burden on the town, being able to verify what their needs were and what were legitimate costs to pay. So in 1825, they decided that they would buy a property in order to house everybody in. And like every other town in Maine, they created themselves a poor farm. And this is the original house. This is the poor farm as it looked back then. There were 3 overseers of the poor appointed, and they quickly got to work and got putting their reports in every annual report of Kennebunk. You can go back to the Brickstore Museum, and they have all of these reports on file quite a ways back, not quite to 1820, but all the way, you know, certainly back to 1914 and further, some of them, you know, earlier. And you can see each account that was entered on behalf of the poor in town. This is just an example page. You'll see here, which I think is kind of sad, they would put out the name of the person that was either in the poorhouse or the person that was providing help to the poor. For instance, some of these people were bringing clothing, or some people were bringing fuel or firewood, and they would be reimbursed. Some of them, as you can see, several of them were for infants to be buried, which is kind of shocking that they had so many. They had a lot of neglected children that came to the poorhouse, so you had a real mixed bag of who was there. This is another year's report. Again, some people would bring clothing, some would bring lodging, would bring medicine, anything like that. The town would reimburse them out of their budget every year. This, if you can see it, is a really old photo of Catmousin Road and High Street. The poor farm can be seen just beyond the 3 houses in the foreground. It's the gambrel roof with the long L, and that is where the poor farm sat on the Catmousin Road, which is really just 4 or 5 houses down from High Street right now. And this is what it looked like. In 1860, they added that barn on the left because they were running out of room. And in subsequent years, they also added a house behind here that you can just see in the background, and that was called the Tramp House. That was moved there in 1894 because I guess they had quite a lot of trouble with transients, and they just referred to them as tramps that would come to town and get a free meal as they were passing through. And at one point, in one report I read that they had up to 700 tramps fed in 1 year. So I guess it was a really bad problem. And this was in addition to the people who were actually housed at the poor farm and who were there as abandoned children or elderly or what have you. Hang on just a second. By all standards, the way this reads is just intolerable, but in 1880 it was pretty standard to have a roster of what they called defective, dependent, and delinquent classes. And you know, that obviously wouldn't fly in today's world, but it's kind of sad. You can see in this case in 1880 there were several people living at the poor farm, and one was an epileptic, one was there because of old age, another was old and blind, several old age, and then the 3 down at the bottom were quote unquote insane. There were a lot of reasons that they would call somebody or determine somebody was insane, and unfortunately some of their reasons weren't all that valid. And if the town or the keepers of the poorhouse decided that they were insane, they would be shipped off to the asylum in Augusta that had just opened its doors in 1840. Augusta, in exchange, would bill the town each year for each person from the town from whence they came for their care. Unfortunately, I've got a number here that's kind of outrageous. Something like Yeah, 11,647 people died at the Augusta Insane Asylum, and that later became, it took on other names as it went along. It was AMHI in the end, and in all of its years from 1840 through 2004 when it closed, those 11,647 persons were buried somewhere in unmarked graves on the 4-acre site, which is kind of sad. They're just, forgotten. This is a drawing of that complex as it was in the 1880s. So it's pretty huge. They would simply record on a piece of log. For instance, if somebody died, they would just say passed away in his sleep. Well, I'm pretty sure that 11,000 people plus didn't just pass away in their sleep at the asylum, but no records are left to find out. Another class of individuals, sad to say, were shipped off to an asylum in Hartford, Connecticut. And it would pretty much be the last the town would see of them as well. And the American Asylum in Hartford kept these individuals and would bill the town annually for their care. You can see on this one person, Jacob Downing, he lost his hearing due to scarlet fever. So let's go to the next one. This is a drawing of that institution in Hartford. And again, it was really called the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb. Times have changed somewhat, thank God. Let's see. So this is, there were really only 3 pictures of the poor farm in existence. And this came to me through a friend of mine, a very elderly gentleman who gave it to me on loan. And it's a great picture because it shows you the diverse content of just who lived at the poor farm. This is taken about 1905, and it shows women, children, young men. I don't even see some of the elderly, but if you think about it, they were all living under that same roof. So it had to be quite a chore. Over the years, the town would appoint different individuals to be the wardens of these inmates of the poor farm, and in exchange for being the wardens, they would live rent-free. And I think they got a stipend of $1 a year, maybe? I'll check that, but I think it's in the next slide. But it's also kind of cool to see that skylights are not a modern invention. If you can look on the top of this roof, it's just for what it's worth. It's kind of interesting to see that there is a skylight in this old picture. But everybody in this picture is, very well dressed, very well turned out for this photograph. So, they don't look like indigent people in desperation. So this is an 1888 article written about the poorhouse, and I'll just kind of paraphrase it. It says that Mrs. Topping keeps pretty much a ship-shape operation there, and in addition to all of the inmates in the poor farm, and I'm sorry to keep using that word, but that's what they were called, she also has to feed at least 7 tramps a day, and that's not unusual. And the selectmen this year decided that they would cut down her wages to $1 a week. There, that's what it was. The next little article below shows that in January of 1875, there were the almshouse, or AKA poor farm, served 700 meals to tramps. I'm still not clear on where these tramps were coming and going and how they came up with all this food to feed them, but it just seems like it was not a real easy thing to do. In the 1900s, the early 1900s, the town voted to place a marble marker on every grave. Now, mind you, by 1888, there were already 50 burials at the poor farm. And so by the 1900s, there was surely close to 100, and the town stepped up and put marble markers on each grave. The one you'll see here is the only one left. It is for a man that I since have learned was walking on the tracks headed from Kennebunk to Biddeford and was struck by a train, and he never made it there. So it's kind of shabby and kind of a shame that this is the condition of the one and only stone that's out there. A kind of a testament to how we've forgotten these individuals. So again, we think, like, we see obviously this man, we can look up and we can learn how he lived and died, but for the most part, they're unnamed people. You don't know much about them until you go to the town reports and you can learn their names, which I have been doing over the last few years, and you learn more about their circumstances and you know, how they came to be in the poorhouse. And in fact, I've learned that amongst all of these children that lived and died there, there were also veterans and in two incidences, women who had murdered a family member. There was a lady who decided that she would murder her 2-year-old child, and they both are buried there. There's another lady who poisoned her husband, and she's buried there. So there were a number of unstable folks along with the people who were there just due to misfortune, as it was labeled in the census records. One fellow that's renowned to have lived there was a man named Elias Hutchins, and Elias was very old, and when he came to live at the poor farm, he was pretty sad that he had to be there, and he had fallen on the town coffers, and so he decided that he had lived a very amazing life, and he would write a book about it and try to raise money to pay for his care, which I think is pretty nice. So this book tells all of his adventures on how he went to sea. He was originally from Cape Porpoise, and he went to sea and was taken by a British sailboat, impressed as a sailor to work on a British sailboat. And on that ship, sailing ship, he actually fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. And many years later, here he is with all of his stories to tell, living in the poor farm of Kennebunk. It's a great book. You can find it at the Brickstore Museum, but you know, he unfortunately didn't make any money on it and wasn't able to pay for any of his expenses. But it's great that we still have this book, and also we know that that's his final resting place. This is the 1860 census that shows the individuals living at the poorhouse, and Elias Hutchins is one of them. You can see him. He was age 77, a mariner born it says New York was his last, where he was last. And also the town selectmen weren't really too worried about naming everybody in their reports. This is a census, so obviously the names are there, but in the reports, everybody's name was there every year. So I mean, that I'm sure caused a lot of shame for a lot of people as well, but they were obviously happy to have some place to live. In my crazed endeavor to try to identify these people, I have started going through every town record I can find, every census record I can find, cross-checking them with all of the cemetery records to make sure that the individuals that are noted as being buried at the poor farm aren't in fact at Hope Cemetery or Evergreen Cemetery or whatnot. My purpose was to put this on a website called Find a Grave. It's an online website that you can look up where your ancestors are buried or anyone else that you're researching is buried. And so I added the Kennebunk Poor Farm Cemetery a number of years ago, and at that time I had the names of 95 people, and that has since grown to 147 individuals. all buried here in the woods and forgotten, which is very, very sad. So if you go to Find a Grave, and I've put a kind of a list of resources on the last slide. If you go to findagrave.com, you can search different cemeteries. You can search Hope Cemetery. You can, if you grew up in another state, you can search for your ancestors in those cemeteries. So I have been trying to add information about those individuals buried in this cemetery so that they're not totally forgotten. This cemetery is on private property. The town sold they stopped using the Poor Farm in 1939, and they sold the land in 1952. The Poor Farm building was torn down, all the structures were torn down, and the individual that lives there now owns a ranch house on Catmausen Road. Very nice person, and they are very aware that this cemetery takes up their entire backyard, and they are actually looking for some guidance and help from the town to try to, at least mark it, fence it, whatever can be done, and that's something I'm working on as town historian, because this is the sad state that it's in right now. In addition to just being kind of a dumping place, which is, really bad. But there are many sources you can look at. I've written down a few here, but for the most part, I think the plan is to just find out every person that we can that was buried in that cemetery, and record their names. And eventually I would like to see the site have a fence around it. The owner of the property would as well, because apparently he says his neighbors like to drive their RVs through there. It's just it's a sad state of affairs. It shouldn't happen. Yet when I compared it to the Kennebunk Poor Farm, same story. It's in the woods. It's not marked. There's no record of people buried there. Every town has a similar story. The one in Arundel is the same. You can find it on deeds indicating that it's somewhere on this person's property, for instance, but there's no record of the people other than doing this kind of research in town reports. So if this is something that interests you, you can certainly give me a call and maybe come up with some ideas on how to move forward with this site. But I'm just trying to, with a lot of these monthly meetings, is to, teach people a little bit, a different facet of Kennebunk, other than, shipbuilders and, well-to-do people, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we had multifaceted past going on, and it should be all recognized and valued. So that's the story. Oops,
I'm going to. Am I audible now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so I've allowed everybody to unmute themselves. If you have questions, feel free to unmute and jump in, or put it in chat if you're more comfortable.
Yeah, I've still got to figure the whole chat world out here. I can leave the screen up for a minute if it's helpful. It just basically tells you where we learn some of the information about these individuals. And the Brickstore Museum has copies of the town reports. That website for cemeteries, again, is called Find a Grave, findagrave.com. There's another website, Newspaper Archives, that pretty much you can learn about poor farms of any town in Maine. It's pretty fascinating. I will stress that this poor farm burial is on private property, so unless you get permission from the owner of the ranch house that's there now, don't just walk out there. It is on private property now.
So we do have one question in the chat that asks, where was the poor farm in Arundel?
From what I've learned, it was off the Day Road. there's a brick house. I don't know if all of you know Day Road, but there's a lovely brick house out there near the end of the Day Road as it joins up to Route 111. And there's a field out there I've been doing deed research on that apparently is where that poor farm, one of those poor farms was.
Were there more than one poor farm in towns, or was it pretty much like one?
Yeah, actually, I
space that
think
they
Arundel had
inhabited?
two. I actually think Arundel had two that I know of. There was also a poor farm on the old, I want to call it the old Port Road, down by the railroad tracks off of Sinnott Road. But yeah, I haven't done a lot of research on those. I do every now and again go across a marker where someone has put one gravestone saying such and such poor farm, and I believe that there's one of those in Arundel as well. But mostly it's a lot of deed research and trying to get the meets and bounds and locations, but it's fun. It's fun to do. And again, I just want these people to, they mattered at some point in their lives, and they, they're just blips on the screen. No one knows that they're there. Oh, I love that. Another dog entered the picture.
Deb, you had a question?
No, actually, I'm writing a novel about the poor farmer gardener.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So a lot of what you said is what I have run into as well, finding people who were there and whatnot. We learned that a lot of the people who died in the poorhouse are buried in the walkways of the cemetery.
Yeah, I believe that.
Underneath the walkway.
Well, you think about it in regard, I mean, that's fascinating, but it's sad too. All of the stones, 100 people who had stones on their graves here in Kennebunk, those have been used for walkways. Those have been used for downspouts. Those have been, it's sad. I see
well,
it
they did, in Gardner, they even purposely buried the people in the
under
cemetery, but underneath the roadways.
Oh my Lord. Well,
So
I guess that's why that law came about, that you cannot dig within 25 feet of a cemetery, because
Right.
that's exactly what they
Part of it.
found.
That's part of it. I found that old police records sometimes give you clues as to who was there because they get arrested and then returned to the poorhouse.
Yeah. It's
and
a,
you're right. Alcoholics, Civil War vets, insane.
and what classified people as insane by today's standard would be you could prosecute them for it. For instance, a lot of the people that went to the asylums could go in for a simple case of melancholy.
Right.
If your husband said that you had melancholy, maybe it was just due to postpartum depression, you would be shipped off without any, nod, just your husband's word, sent off to the insane asylum, and you would never come back.
That's right.
And
It's
that's
terrifying.
just tragic.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I hope your novel comes out great. That's inspiring.
Well, it's difficult because, as you have already pointed out, the variation is, the people who were in there were just like, how do you possibly live with in Gardner, there were 18 people in the poorhouse.
At times at this building, there was certainly that many as well. And then the whole so-called tramp aspect, I need to learn more about what caused the transience.
It was economic. There were no jobs. People were trying to find work, and they knew that if they passed through,
they get a meal.
And oftentimes they offered to split wood or.
Well, I think it became a law actually. I read something today that it became a law that they actually had to work for their food after 1878 or something like that. They had to actually put in some work if they were going to get a meal, which I think lessened the numbers by far.
I always think about, can you imagine the laundry?
One person trying to meet the needs of so many diverse people, some who were ambulatory, some who, couldn't function, children galore. It boggles the mind that somebody could keep it all together on so little and for $1 a week,
We've got another question in the chat that says, what led to the closing of the poorhouse? Was it the creation of state and federal social programs during the New Deal of the 1930s?
I believe it was. I believe that's a lot of it. Deb, you can probably answer that as well, but I believe that was the thrust of it, was that they were dealing with people in a different way, and these places were becoming decrepit and they weren't suitable for habitation any longer, was a big part of it. I mean, you think about this one building here in Kennebunk, built in 1752, all the way used until 1939. It was actually used after 39, not as a poorhouse, but it was used as a pest house and a place for one of the flus that, you know, as a care facility. So they had different uses for it, but I think that it is right. You know, a lot of the state aid came in and different ways to care for these individuals.
Do you have any other questions?
Looks like that's it.
As an item of interest, I can tell you that the poorhouse in Gardner is still standing. It's a gorgeous.
Oh,
brick
that's so
building.
interesting.
It's just beautiful. And
Oh,
what's interesting about it is now low-income housing.
oh,
Which I
so it's
think is-
kind of morphed into the, wow,
Yeah.
interesting.
I think it's fascinating. I really do. But the
I do
building
too.
itself is just stunning. It's just beautiful.
Wow, that's so neat. I wish this building was still standing, because it's one of the earliest colonial houses we had,
Oh, yeah, it's a pretty house. Yeah.
but it's gone. Well, thank you all for coming, and Allison, as always, thank you. Good luck, Deb, on your book.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
may have to hit you up for some information from time to time.
Oh, do it. I'd love it. I'd love it. It's great. It's great.
Very cool. All
Thank
right,
you
guys.
so
I'm gonna
much.
sign off. There's no other questions. Have a good night and a happy holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.